Well, let's go ahead and get started. Good morning, everybody. Thrilled to have you back for day 3 of our journey. Share the hashtags, head out on Twitter and LinkedIn. I saw a few on Instagram, but here's where you'll find us as you're searching around the hashtags. Next slide. Let's talk a little bit about what our day is going to look like. We are going to start with an incredible overview from Cavoukian. I'll introduce her in a minute. I'm so excited that she's with us today. We will roll from that into 2 major threads for the late morning and going into the early afternoon, where Sam Becker takes us on skills of the future, and then Kate Javicchini and Michelle Watt will be working with us on the Trusted Learner Network and their Unconference. More on that in a bit. From there, we'll go to some neighborhood breakouts, and then we'll have a future kind of a committing on what we're going to be looking towards actually committing to, and then a closeout. Next slide. So you guys have seen these thus far. They're the tenets by which the entire conference is really grounded in our initiatives here in Digital Trust. It is really grounded in all the work that we do. And I think as we've gone through the last couple of days, you've gotten to see some expressions of how we're thinking as a community about transparency and help. Privacy by design, we're about to spend a lot of time on that one. Security by design, we had a lot of that with our vendors and other partners and speakers yesterday. And then agency at the center with the debut of Pocket. In fact, if we kind of think through what's happened over the last couple of days, we heard from Joanna and Jim on Tuesday, really asking us to think, okay, we can do all these things with our data. What should we be doing? We rolled in yesterday morning around this time and had a bunch of students who came in and frankly told us it was simply untrue that their generation wasn't interested in privacy. In fact, if anything, their generation is helping us think much more deeply about privacy. And through the work that these students were doing, whether it was on the forefront of working in other countries or working on vaccines, we got some real insights from them around this tension between what's private and what's public, and how we think about getting on the other side of a liminal period like the pandemic with a greater understanding of the tension between those two. From that, we went with Marcus and Ada, who took us on quite a journey. That's going to be a fun one to go back and listen to the recording to again, on how we're molding technology and asking us some pretty deep questions around how do we actually approach some ethics and wisdom as we think about shaping this new world we're heading into. Yesterday, a variety of panels, lots of fantastic conversations deep into security practices, deep into privacy conversations with our students. A handful of us actually experienced a little bit of a breach in trust. And so out of that, we got to see how the teams rallied around to make sure that was okay. My apologies if you were in that session and part of it. Took a little break, came back in the afternoon, and we saw Pocket, and lots of wonderful conversations around that. Our first view into ASU's work in self-sovereign identity and our work towards taking these technologies and actually creating an experience that's legitimately designed to empower our users. This morning, we're going to focus in on privacy by design, and then we're going to have, I had mentioned those 2 threads earlier. I'm going to pull in a couple of my colleagues. Sam, I think you're the first one. Next slide. Could you talk to us a little bit about, oh, no, I forgot. Give me a second, Sam. How could I forget? All of this is co-created with a whole bunch of our fantastic friends and families. Top Tall, who had the fun game with us on Tuesday night, and then a wonderful cyber session yesterday. CrowdStrike, that crew was here with us too, as was Informatica Proofpoint, and of course, Palo Alto, and the Leonardo team. We're actually presenting on 2 panels yesterday. So great to have them here. Sorry about that, Sam. Tell us what you're going to be doing with us after we get our time with Anne.
Well, thank you, Donna. Like you, I was really inspired by the student panel yesterday, hearing about students' hopes and dreams for the future, what they're working on now, the emerging technology applications they're looking forward to. And so that was a really good primer for the session that I have the privilege of leading, which is the Skills of the Future Virtual Career Fair. So you're not going to want to miss out on that one. It's going to be a bunch of our co-conveners, plus ASU getting in the mix. And at the very, very beginning, everyone's going to have just 2 minutes to make a pitch as to why participants should join their breakout session. and learn more about their views on skills of the future, what they value, what, sort of the prized sort of positions and roles right now are, how that's going to look in the future. And this is definitely not for people just looking for jobs, or, even though we very much welcome people who are looking for opportunities to come, and especially students who are graduating and looking for opportunities. But this is actually a career fair about career mobility and what skills are going to be needed in the future to actually advance so many of the concepts Donna just beautifully described about digital trust, privacy by design, security by design, all easier said than done. It's going to be the people that implements that in the technology in our processes. So you're not going to want to miss hearing from TopTal, CrowdStrike, Proofpoint, Palo Alto Networks, Leonardo, and even we have representatives from ASU, Elizabeth Riley from Data Intelligence in the house to talk about what a career at the University Technology Office at ASU looks like. So just don't miss this opportunity to hear from everyone, and then choose a few different breakout rooms to go into to learn more and to have a conversation with people at the forefront of hiring and leading major digital trust businesses. Really excited.
Yeah, that's great. I think the next couple slides were for you, Sam. You did beautifully driving blind. Can I get, yeah. And then the next one. There we go.
Yeah, so this is a lineup specifically, not necessarily the order, but you're going to get to hear from this wonderful lineup. These are people you're not going to want to miss the opportunity to speak with either. And the good news too is a lot of them are hanging out in the Digital Trust Slack lobby, and there's ways to get in touch too if you don't have a chance to get that one-on-one time. So see you in a few after this morning's keynote. Make sure to join us. And if you're wondering how to access that, there will be a link on the website in the agenda next to this session that takes you right there.
Thanks so much, Sam. Now, concurrent with what Sam's doing, Kate Cavoukian, next slide, please. Kate, what are you and Michelle Watt up to?
There, folks.
Next slide.
Yeah, let's see the next slide. Oh, there we are. Okay, so Michelle Watt and I will be hosting a double session. It's called the TLN Unconference. It's 2.0. So we strongly invite all the folks that have joined us, both from last year, March 2020's inaugural Unconference, to join us, as well as any new folks, where we will be spending some time talking about the Trusted Learner Network, a envisioned DLT-backed digital credential network that has been cooking at ASU for several years. We really invite all opinions and all perspectives, where we'll give a brief overview of sort of where we've been and where we plan to go with the TLN, and then we'll break out into unconference sessions around some exciting topics like digital identity, like privacy, technology, learner empowerment, and value proposition. So we really look forward to you being there. Again, it's a double session, but it's going to go by in a flash based on our experience last year. You'll be able to join that session again by, to Sam's point, navigating to our agenda, and you'll find the Zoom link right there, and looking forward to seeing everybody at 10.
Thanks, Kate. Thanks, Michelle. I am really looking forward to that. This last round, when we had folks here in the Phoenix Valley with us last year, was the last time I saw people before the pandemic. That was March 2nd and 3rd. And then shortly thereafter, we all kind of hunkered down for about a year. So it'll be great to re-engage with everybody. Next slide. Without further ado, let's talk about what it is without privacy and there can be no data ethics. Really, really looking forward to this conversation. Next slide, please, with Anne Cavoukian. She's the executive director of the Global Privacy and Security Design Center, and has really done and been the voice for deeply thinking about privacy and privacy by design since the late 90s, for as long as I've been paying attention to the space. Are you there, Anne?
I am. Can you hear me? Can you see?
I can.
Okay.
Yes.
Good.
Good morning.
Here,
Good
looking
morning.
forward to speaking with you. I wish I could be with you live. I miss being with people live. I'm far too social for social distancing.
Well, let's do this again when it's not 118 degrees in Phoenix.
You got it. Let's do it in November. That's perfect.
Sounds like a good plan. That's right around Cybersecurity Month. I think that's October. We might be able to do that.
Perfect.
Hey guys, I'm just going to hand this over to Anne. Anne, I'm so thrilled you're here.
Thank you.
Take it away.
Thank you so much, ladies and gentlemen. It's a pleasure to be speaking with you today. And I'm going to ask Donna to advance my slides. And I'm going to start by, in the next slide, talking about the myths. There are so many myths associated with privacy. It's mind-boggling. In the next slide, people think, oh, well, if you don't have anything to hide, what's the problem? There's no problem, right? You should just give everything away to the state, to companies, whatever. It's nonsense. Privacy is not about secrecy. It's not about having something to hide. In the next slide, I talk about privacy being all about control. In the next slide, personal control is absolutely critical. You, as the user, have to be in control of your personal information. You have to have the freedom to choose who you wish to share your data with, to whom you wish to have it disclosed. You see, you are the only one who knows the context associated with your data. Is it sensitive? Is it not? I always say, look, privacy is not a religion. You want to give away your information, be my guest, as long as you make the decision to do so. The Germans have a wonderful term for this called informational self-determination, that it should be the individual who determines the fate of his or her personal information. And I can't tell you how important that is. You know, Germany went through so much. And when everything finally lifted after the last World War, they said, never again will we allow the state to strip us of our privacy and our freedom. And they have stood by that again and again. I've been to many conferences in Germany. They lead globally in terms of privacy and data protection. I applaud them. So informational self-determination is one of their key core messages. In the next slide, I always like to give the example too, that privacy is absolutely essential to freedom. You cannot have free and open societies without a solid foundation of privacy. And innovation, creativity, all of this, it's the result of wonderful prosperity in a society based on freedom. And privacy is at the heart of this. Surveillance is the exact opposite, is the antithesis of privacy. One of the negative consequences of surveillance is it usurps your your cognitive bandwidth. It shrinks you in. Sorry, I'm a psychologist. I talk in terms of cognitive bandwidth, but the point is, it makes you look over your shoulder. You're afraid to speak freely and have crazy blue sky thinking because people are looking at what you're doing. We don't want surveillance. It's the exact opposite of what we want. In the next slide, I talk about the decade of privacy by design. It started in a funny way. Well, I was first appointed commissioner in Ontario, Canada in the late 90s. And when I joined the office, I had many wonderful lawyers, but like most lawyers, they're committed to regulatory compliance following privacy laws. There's a privacy infraction, a data breach, you apply the privacy law, you get a wonderful outcome, and you fix the situation. I didn't want to just fix the problems. I wanted to prevent them. I wanted a model of prevention, much like a medical model of prevention, where you embed much needed privacy protective measures into the design of your operations, bake it into the code, make it an essential part of your operation so you can't forget about it. It's always there. And so I created Privacy by Design, literally at my kitchen table over 3 nights, and then went into the office and sold it to my fellow lawyers. My lawyers were wonderful. It took a while because it was a very different model than regulatory compliance. But then we had great success. In the next slide, please. In 2010, and one more slide, please. Privacy by Design was passed as an international standard by the International Assembly of Privacy Commissioners and Data Protection Authorities. See, once a year, privacy commissioners have a global conference, usually in Europe. In 2010, it was in Jerusalem. And at the end of a 3 or 4 day conference, we have a half-day closed session where we introduce resolutions, various commissioners. And I introduced a resolution that privacy by design should be passed as an international standard to complement privacy laws, regulatory compliance after the fact. We should embed it into our technologies, our business practices, right from the outset, proactively. And to my amazement, it was unanimously passed. And I was amazed because, as I said, most commissioners are, lawyers. They're brilliant lawyers that love to apply, Section 29, Sub 2, Part A to the fact situation and get a wonderful remedy. Very important, but it wasn't enough. And everyone agreed. So afterwards, I spoke to my fellow commissioners and thanked them. And I expressed my surprise that they all voted in favor of this. And they said, Anne, in this day and age of daily connectivity, social media bounding, we don't stand a chance in just you doing regulatory compliance after the fact. Then we're just hitting the tip of the iceberg. In the next slide, please. They said, we can't just do the tip of the iceberg, leaving the majority of privacy breaches remaining unchallenged, unregulated, and unknown. They said regulatory compliance alone is no longer sustainable as the sole model for ensuring the future of privacy. I loved it. I was delighted that we were all on the same page. And I've had such great success with privacy by design. In the next slide, please. It's been translated into 40 languages, literally all over the world. And not a week would go by that I wouldn't hear from some jurisdiction about what they were doing. It was really delightful. And in the next slide, I'm going to tell you the two essentials to privacy by design. I've already spoken of the first one. I want to prevent the privacy harms from arising. So you have to be proactive, upfront, embed much needed privacy protective measures into the design of your operations, bake it into the code. But equally important, I want to banish zero-sum models. I cannot tell you how this is everywhere. Zero-sum means you can only have one positive gain, always to the detriment of the other, a loss on the other side. So an increase in security, always to the detriment of privacy. Increase in data utility, always to the detriment of privacy. Win, lose, either or. And I can assure you, it was never privacy that won over the other interests, nor am I suggesting that it should be. But I sure as hell wasn't going to have it lose out every time. And so the whole model of zero sum, this either or, is so dated. In fact, when I was in graduate school at the University of Toronto, Anatole Rappaport, he was the father of game theory. He created it, zero sum, positive sum. And I used to just fawn over him as a graduate student. And I always used to say to him, me being the eternal optimist, Professor Rappaport, why do people embrace zero sum models? It's win-lose. I'd rather have win-win. Why do they do that? And he said, Anne, it's simple. Zero-sum models are the lazy man's way out because it's much easier just to have success in one area, always to the detriment of the other area. He said, but it's short-lived. Positive sum, resulting in multiple positive gains, much better outcome. And I've never forgotten that. So in the next slide, please, I always tell you to get rid of the dated win-lose, either or zero-sum model. That is so yesterday. And in the next slide, please. And of course, I've discussed this with many colleagues, data scientists. I remember speaking to Bruce Schneier, brilliant data scientist, cryptographer. And he said, Anne, of course we have to change the model to a positive sum model where we can have win-win versus involving these unnecessary trade-offs and their false dichotomies. He said, Anne, zero sum, it's a false dichotomy of either or, win-lose. Let's get rid of the verses and substitute and. And I'm not suggesting that that's always easy to do, but the end result, I promise you, is far, far better. So let's try to have this positive mindset of and, privacy and data utility, privacy and security, privacy and marketing. Believe it or not, the Canadian Marketing Association invites me to give the annual keynote at their annual conference. And I always start by saying, I'm sure I'm the least popular speaker here today. And fortunately, they laugh, thank God. And they say, no, we know we got to listen to your ideas. So I always say privacy is not anti-marketing, it's pro-choice. You've got to give people a choice and have their voices heard. In the next slide, please. I'm going to go over very quickly. There are 7 foundational principles to privacy by design, and I've already covered a number of them, so I'll go through them very quickly. Proactive, not reactive. You want to prevent the harms from arising. Let me spend a moment on the second one, though. Privacy is the default setting. This is huge. This is a game changer. What it means is, what the current model is, you as a consumer or citizen, you are expected, if you want to protect your privacy, to search through all the terms of service and all the legalese in the privacy policy to search for the opt-out box that says, do not use my personal information for any purpose other than the primary purpose of the data collection that I consented to. I mean, that takes hours to do. Life is short. No one has time to do that. But it doesn't mean that people don't care deeply about privacy. There has never been greater concern for privacy as there has been now in the last 2 years. It's amazing. I've been in this business, believe me, a long time. In the last 2 years, all of the public opinion polls, Pew Internet Research, etc., have come in at the 90 percentile for concern for privacy. 90% of those surveyed very concerned for privacy. 92% concerned about loss of control over their personal information. And as I mentioned earlier, privacy revolves around personal control. So privacy as the default setting flips that on its head and it says, forget about that. We don't expect you to go search for the opt-out box. No. We give you privacy automatically. It's the default setting. We are only permitted to use your personal information for the primary purpose of the data collection. That's it. We can't use it for anything else. Later on, down the road, if a secondary use arises that we'd like to use your personal information for, we have to come back to you and obtain your positive consent. Game changer. This builds trust like no other. And there is such a trust deficit right now, which is mounting on a daily basis. Companies that have gotten certified for privacy by design have come back to me and they said, this has built trusted business relationships with their customers more than anything else. Total game changer. It's huge. And also later on, when I talk about the EU and what they're doing in the European Union with the GDPR, they've included both privacy by design and privacy as the default setting in the General Data Protection Regulation. Unbelievable. Okay, 3, embedded into design. I think that speaks for itself. When it's a part of your design, baked into your code, you can't forget about it. It's always there. It's not something you can overlook because it always has a presence. That's what you want. I've already spent a lot of time talking to you about full functionality, positive sum, not zero sum. I cannot tell you what a difference this makes. Huge difference, builds trust like no other, and you will get multiple positive gains from doing this. Let me talk about security for a moment. Number 5. While the term privacy subsumes a much broader set of protections than security alone, in this day and age of daily hacking and cybersecurity attacks, if you don't have a strong foundation of security from end to end with full lifecycle protection, you're not going to have any privacy. So you always have to start with strong security. Visibility and transparency. You have to give people a right of access to their own information. You know, I tell both companies and governments, you may have custody and control over someone's personal information, but it doesn't belong to you. It belongs to them, the data subject. So please give them a right of access to their own information. And the beauty of this is companies, again, who have been certified with privacy by design have come back to me and they said, we love this. Because as it turns out, when people can access their information, they go back to the company and they say, no, that's not true anymore. That was true 2 years ago. Here's the correct information about me now. It increases the quality of the information companies hold on you. So it's a huge win for companies and it gives people a right of access to their own information. Again, win-win. And respect for user privacy, keeping it user-centric. I could have started with that as the first foundational principle, because when you have it focused on the user and respect the user's privacy and the user's needs, all of this will flow. Now, you may say, well, this is interesting, but it doesn't happen in real life, right? It's too hard to do all of this. Au contraire. In the next slide, please. This is a paper that is a compilation of 22 papers that we wrote when I was commissioner, with all of the major tech companies in the world. Think of any major tech company: Microsoft, Intel, HPE, IBM, of course, Oracle, of course. I'm leaving out a number of them. We wrote 22 papers with them on these subject areas: surveillance cameras and transit systems, biometrics being used, smart meters on the smart grid, NFCs, of course, mobile communication, RFIDs and sensors. I could go on and on. I'll give you one example. Remote home healthcare, the paper we wrote with Intel. With the aging population, the boomers getting older, and people, as they age, still want to live in their home, even if they have to live in their home alone by themselves. But they may need some help from time to time. So with the total consent of the individuals living in the house, Intel developed sensors that you could put throughout the house on various objects to offer assistance to the individuals. For example, a sensor on someone's bed. You get up in the middle of the night to use the restroom. You don't return within a predetermined period of time. Maybe you had a fall. Maybe something happened. The sensor will go off, and it will only go, first of all, in an encrypted manner to the 3 people that you authorized to get this information to send you help, to see if you're all right, healthcare, whatever. And it's just a brilliant model, all with the positive consent of the individuals involved. They love it. It allows them to enjoy the benefit of living in their house alone, but with assistance that they may need from time to time. So take a look at this paper. It's on the website, and I think you'll enjoy it. I loved it. In the next slide, please. And I can also tell you that, as I said, this is followed all around the world. Just before I left as commissioner, I got a letter from JIPDEC, the Japanese Information Processing Development Center. And I loved it. They said, we've heard from Japan's private sector companies that we need to insist on the principle of positive sum, not zero sum, and become enlightened with privacy by design. And I thought, if the Japanese, whose first language is not English, can understand the value of positive sum versus zero sum, then surely the rest of us English-speaking people can grasp the importance of this. Now you might say, okay, but what's it going to cost me? Obviously, there's a cost involved with doing everything, including privacy by design. But in the next slide, please, I can show you it is a fraction, a fraction of the cost doing it proactively versus waiting until you have a data breach or privacy infraction, which will cost you into the millions. And I'm not kidding. These days, they're not lawsuits that are just filed against companies. They're class action lawsuits that easily can cost into the millions. But the damage to your brand, the damage to your reputation may be irreparable because of the loss of consumer confidence and trust. I remember years ago, about 4 or 5 years ago, Target had a major privacy data breach in the United States. And I love Target. Whenever I'm in Arizona, I'm shopping at Target. And they didn't used to have Target stores in Canada, which is where I live. But about 5 years ago, they started building some Target stores in Canada, and we loved it. But then when the data breach happened, everything changed overnight. In the United States, the CEO of Target resigned. In Canada, the president of Target Canada was fired. And within a few months, people weren't going to Target anymore because there was such a loss of confidence and concern over one's data. They've shut down all the Target stores here now in Canada, which broke my heart because I love going to Target, as I said, so I can't wait to get back to Arizona in the fall. So it's very important. Be proactive, spend a little bit up front. It'll be a fraction of the cost you will spend after the fact if you have a data breach or privacy infraction. And your customers will thank you for it. That's the beauty of it. When you do privacy by design, I always tell everyone, tell your customers, shout it from the rooftops, because customers love it. It keeps the loyalty of the customers you have and attracts new opportunity and new customers. It's a total win-win. Now, in the next slide, please let me switch to the European Union. What they're doing in Europe, 2018, it came into effect, the General Data Protection Regulation, the GDPR. Huge, huge new law. Next slide, please. Which took a while. It was introduced in 2012, but finally came into effect 2018. But it strengthens and unifies data protection dramatically throughout the entire European Union. And most important, it gives citizens so much control over their personal information, totally enhances personal control, simplifies regulations, makes privacy accessible, and strengthens it dramatically. And the interesting thing is that countries all around the world, we're all upgrading our privacy laws so that we can achieve essential equivalence with the GDPR, because everyone wants to do business with Europe and engage in trade, etc. Canada used to have essential equivalence with the with the privacy laws in Europe until the GDPR came into effect. And once the GDPR came into effect, our law is no longer essentially equivalent. It's terrible. We're working now on upgrading it. We still have a lot of work to do. So this is an amazing law. All around the world, it's now being followed, and upgraded laws being upgraded. Brazil just introduced a privacy data protection law last year, totally in line with the GDPR and with privacy by design. Oh, so in the next slide, the other exciting thing about the GDPR for me, they included privacy by design. Amazing, as data protection by design and privacy as the default, the second foundational principle, which I told you is the game changer. This is huge. To have privacy, data protection by design, and privacy as the default in this amazing new law, which is being followed all around the world. I mean, it is unbelievable. I was just delighted, needless to say. And in the next slide, please, as I said, it's being followed all around the world. And Information Age wrote an article about this, and they said it's not too much of a stretch to say that if you implement privacy by design, you've mastered the GDPR. But I want to tell you, there's much more to the GDPR than privacy by design. But I think what she meant here, what this reflects, is the fact that if you rise to doing privacy by design, you will already have met a lot of the other requirements of the GDPR, because privacy by design requires so much in terms of privacy and data protection, proactively embedding it throughout all of your operations. In the next slide, please. We're Privacy Commissioner of Canada. As I said, we have to upgrade our laws. So he said, we need to upgrade our laws. We are no longer have essential equivalence with the GDPR, and we need to add approaches like privacy by design, because after all, they've included it in Europe, and it was created by a Canadian, and Cavoukian, so we've got to do this. And in response to this, in the next slide, please, the federal government prepared a report called Towards Privacy by Design, suggesting that the implementation, the upgrade of our federal private sector legislation should incorporate privacy by design. Do you think they've done this? Don't get me going on this. They have not done this yet, so I'm not going to even go there, because I want to keep this on a good positive note. In the next slide, please. Instead of waiting for this law, what I'm doing now is, I think, did we miss one? If you go back just one slide. No, okay, it doesn't matter. Let's go to the next slide. So I'm offering privacy by design certification now, as I mentioned. We're doing this with KPMG, and I have an online course now at Ryerson University on this. And I'm now actually teaching a new course called Trust by Design. If you have any interest in that, send me an email. Okay, let's turn now to some negative stuff, but then I'm going to end it on a positive note. In the next slide, please, I want to talk to you about surveillance. And unfortunately, the tide is now turning towards surveillance. I'm going back 5 years, because in the United Kingdom, in England, they passed this thing called the Investigatory Powers Bill. In the next slide, it just was so sad, because there was a petition against it to repeal the surveillance powers. And they had 100,000 signatures because they wanted to repeal this terrible, they called it the Snoopers Charter, described as the most extreme snooping, spying law in a Western democracy. But unfortunately, it didn't get repealed. And in the next slide, please, we have, and that should be UK mass digital surveillance regime was ruled unlawful. And this law remains in effect in the UK, and it's spreading, unfortunately. In the next slide, please. Again, I mentioned the 100,000 signatures that we had, but for whatever reason, it didn't go anywhere. That's the very sad news about all of this. There were petitions against this bill and all this, but it did not get repealed. And the next slide, please. I unfortunately said, is surveillance becoming the new normal of the internet? And in fact, a lot of people think that. Bruce Schneier, a brilliant cryptographer, a dear colleague of mine, he said, Anne, I'm sorry, but surveillance is the business model of the internet. This was a number of years ago, 4 or 5 years ago, but it's still real. In the next slide, please, we talk about the unintended consequences. In the next slide, all about the increasing availability of what they're calling data fumes. I love that expression. Data produced as a byproduct of people's use of tech devices and services, which of course is everywhere. And this has both political and practical implications for the way that people are seen and treated by the state and by the private sector. These data fumes are everywhere. And it's like people are just breathing in all kinds of implications from data that have been collected for tech services and devices. And when we're talking about data problems and tech, let's talk about the Internet of Things. And the next slide, please. The Internet of Things is terrible. It's like the Wild West. They're running out the door without any thought of concern for privacy or security. So, as I said here, the question companies should be asking is not whether there will be an attack involving IoT devices and infrastructure, but when. They simply do not spend enough time on any of this. And that is the enormous concern here that people have to worry about. IoT is just a nightmare, and it's a privacy nightmare waiting to happen. So if you have any IoT in any areas that you're working with, please make sure that you embed privacy and security into it, because it's certainly not done automatically. In the next slide, please, I talk about identity theft. Oh, this is the most heartbreaking thing. This was 5 years ago, 1.1 billion identities stolen. Now it's probably double that. And when I was commissioner, a number of victims of identity theft came to me and they said, please help us. We can't, they don't believe us that it wasn't me who racked up all those charges. It was someone who stole my identity. And the first thing I always used to say to them is go to the police and file an occurrence report, something that at least substantiates your claim that your identity was stolen. And then I would work with them tediously, and it would take months, years sometimes to clear up people's identity. And so this is one of the huge concerns with IoT and all kinds of other things in terms of your data and your identity being stolen. All of this points to, in the next slide, please, the absolutely vital need for encryption. This is so important. I cannot emphasize enough how encrypting your data, having it appear in code so that only people who have the keys to open up the encryption can gain access to it. Absolutely critical, and end-to-end encryption is so important. In the next slide, please. This is just one of the things that I did. One of my op-ed that I wrote on encryption being critical to privacy and freedom. It's just absolutely vital. I can't emphasize it enough. And so I just urge everyone to take this seriously. Wherever you can, if you can encrypt your information, please do so. And there's all kinds of amazing encryption. There's something called homomorphic encryption, which is huge. And it allows data analytics, statistical analysis, et cetera, to take place on the encrypted data. So you don't even have to decrypt it to get all kinds of stats from it. It's a total win-win. And there's all kinds of things. And also end-to-end encryption, like Apple has on their devices. And WhatsApp uses end-to-end encryption, but it's being challenged everywhere. We're going to talk about backdoors in a moment, but in India, they're challenging end-to-end encryption. They're trying to get rid of encryption, which people need desperately. But I digress. Okay, next slide, please. I'll try to go faster. The debate over encryption, it's just continuing, and it will be growing dramatically. In the next slide, please. I'd love you to read this paper. It's called Keys Under Doormats. It's written by 15 of the world's leading cryptographers all around the world. They wrote a paper opposing backdoors, a backdoor that can break into encryption. And they called it Keys Under Doormats because they wanted to appeal to the layperson, to show the average person who's, not up to date on encryption or isn't familiar with it, that just as you might leave a key under the doormat to enable your child to gain entry into your home just in case they lose their keys, it will also enable the thieves to break into your house. Keys under doormats, backdoors to encryption should be completely denied, not allowed, etc. But it's happening, and unfortunately, I remember this took place. First discussion of this was called the Clipper chip, like in the year 2000. I was commissioner at the time, and for a whole year, everyone debated this all around the world, and ended by everyone saying this is a bad idea. Backdoors are a bad idea; they should not be permitted. But it's raising its ugly head again, and in the last 5 years, we're having to deal with this. Next slide, please. And there's so much argument against this. It's like finding a needle in a haystack. You will have access to my slides, so I'm going to go quickly now because I see I only got 10 minutes left. Next slide, please. The question of what works and what doesn't is very important. And there's so much you can do. Profiling hundreds of millions of the good citizens, law-abiding citizens, to unmask a few bad guys is a terrible idea. And it doesn't work for the most part. And it eliminates all the freedom of all the millions, hundreds of millions of law-abiding citizens. Next slide, please. What you can do is you can do targeted surveillance versus indiscriminate surveillance. Don't do phishing expeditions. Target on who you think you need to look for. If you're a law enforcement agency, if you have probable cause, you can go to the court, get a warrant, which enables you to gain access into more information. Next slide, please. If we don't do that, we're going to have, as Professor David Lyons said, a surveillance winter. He talks about the chilling effect on freedom. In the US, with the Patriot Act, Section 215, this metadata program, it does absolutely nothing. It hasn't been of any use in stopping terror attacks, but it results in breaking into lots of people's information. The answer is we should have much more targeted surveillance, which is far better. We need to have both privacy and security. In the next slide, please. That's what I talk about. And so many people agree. Michael Chertoff, dear colleague of mine, who was the second secretary of Homeland Security, he said, look, you can't have privacy without security. And the most frustrating thing is when people treat privacy and security as if they were trade-offs. They're not. I couldn't agree more. In the next slide, please. Michael Rogers as well, who needs no introduction as the NSA chief. He staked out a pro-encryption policy. And he said encryption is foundational to the future. It's a waste of time arguing about it. There's been a lot of talk about giving up security for privacy or vice versa. No, both are paramount. We must have both. And that's what I want to remind you of. Get rid of zero sum, one interest versus the other. You must have both. We can have both. We have to resist attacks on this. Next slide, please. Once again, there's been an increased call for backdoors in the last few years. The tech groups are rejecting calls for data encryption backdoors again and again, weakening encryption to create backdoors for use by the good guys would also create vulnerabilities that will be exploited by the bad guys. Everybody knows this. And I have to applaud, in the next slide, please, Susan Landau, professor, University of California, she appeared before the House Judicial Committee hearing a few years ago. And she said, "Are you kidding me?" She said, rather than providing us with better security, the FBI's efforts to mandate the creation of crypto backdoors will torpedo it. Please don't forget that. It will torpedo it. She said, encryption and other protections secure our systems. They should never, ever be undermined. I know Susan, she's a dear colleague. I just applauded her for this testimony, because we've got to convince everyone out there that attempting to do backdoors is just utter folly, and it won't work. In the next slide, please. Just more information once again on how misunderstood terrorism is and how the us versus them mentality will never stop attacks. And so this is a book that was written by Dr. Sedgman, and he's a counterterrorism researcher, former CIA operations operative. And he said, it just doesn't work sifting through the haystack in terms of in the search of terrorists. He said, even if you carry it out to the full extent, which would be a nightmare for our freedoms and civil liberties, it would still be ineffective, because terrorism is such a statistically rare phenomenon. It is rarely effective. Next slide, please. Anyway, I'm going to stop talking about this. I continue talking about this all the time, because it's the government-fueled media hysteria that they get everyone so excited about. They're going to be attacked, so we have to do something and get rid of privacy, get rid of encryption. It's ridiculous. Terrorism will simply not be defeated by outlawing encryption, and we can't get distracted by the call by law enforcement agencies again and again to do this. And that's what I want you to remember. I mentioned India at the beginning. This is starting now in India. It's huge. I've done multiple media interviews with India, and I've written a paper with them to try to protect them, to preserve end-to-end encryption. WhatsApp has launched a lawsuit against the government in India because they want to ban the end-to-end encryption in WhatsApp, and they want to introduce a system that would basically unravel the end-to-end encryption and reveal the first individual who started the emails and get rid of it. It's just a nightmare. So we have to fight this, and I suspect we're going to have to continue to fight this for time immemorial, because law enforcement, understandably, is very effective. And whenever there's terrorism, they appeal to the public and they say, we have to get rid of terrorism. It's a terrible nightmare. It's going to haunt us. We need to be able to break into encrypted communications, get backdoors. No, you don't. Law enforcement has enormous powers. As I said, if they have probable cause, they can get a warrant that will enable them to gain access to a lot of information. So please do not buy into this. I'm going to end on an unusual note because we don't have time to talk about it, but I also want to talk about artificial intelligence, AI, because we have to talk a little bit about ethics, just a little. Ethics is a big part of privacy, and it's so important that we maintain an ethical approach to the work that we do in privacy. So if you, in the next slide, please, you can just take a look at this on your own. I'm not going to go into it, but I also developed something called AI Ethics by Design. If any of you do any work in the area of ethics and AI, there's so much going on with artificial intelligence, and we really need to embed some system of AI, of ethical design and privacy into AI, because just letting AI go off on its own without any consequence or without, looking under the hood. I always say, you've got to look under the hood, trust but verify. We've got to be able to do that with AI as well. So keep this in mind. Next slide, please. Let me end, ladies and gentlemen, by just encouraging you to think of privacy and security risks that they're best managed by proactively embedding them into all that you do through the principles of privacy by design, prevent the privacy harms from arising, avoid the data breaches. Focusing on prevention will allow you to do that. It's much easier and much more cost effective to build in both privacy and security upfront into the code, bake it into your operations rather than after the fact. It also reflects the most ethical treatment of personal data that you hold. You know, I hate zero-sum thinking, either or, win, lose, get rid of that. Embrace doubly enabling systems where you have privacy and security, privacy and data utility. You can have both and you'll have much better results, win-win. And a colleague of mine, Kai Rannenberg in Europe, he said to me a long time ago, if people are smart, they'll lead with privacy by design. Most of the time, they might just get privacy by chance, but far worse, they get privacy by disaster, and you get the regulators knocking on your door. And that's the last thing you want. So think of privacy by design. And in my next slide, if you have any questions, you can email me. My email address is somewhere in the next slide. That's not it. Under contact information, if you have that, I hope they show my contact information because
we will definitely put it in the Slack if it's
okay.
If there's not a slide.
Thank you. And I also, in that contact information, if any of you are on Twitter, every morning I tweet the latest privacy stories of the day between 5 and 6 a.m. My husband is a saint, but I love to get stories out. There's a lot of them come from Europe and the East. So if you're interested, you can follow me on Twitter and you can stay on top of what's happening in privacy. I'll end now. Thank you for your time, ladies and gentlemen, and I'll turn it back to you.
And thanks so much. That's just a fantastic set of things for us to think about. And you know, we've got like 4 minutes. Can I ask you one question?
Of course.
Many of the people in this room, and I would say I may know a representative sample. There are a lot of folks here I don't know, but we've come from very diverse jobs, all sorts of different roles. And so for just the folks that I do know that are here, they're everything from portfolio managers and project managers and creators and university administrators. I'm curious, do you have ideas or have you seen things that are effective for someone who wants to be a practitioner of privacy by design, but doesn't have it as their full role?
Of course, and I'm glad you raised that question because often the privacy related issues are a portion of someone's job, what they're doing during their performance, etc. And so I love telling people, if you can, get the importance of privacy generally, that messaging to your boss or to the CEO or to the board of directors. Because if you can get the messaging up that the privacy of your customers, your clients, whoever you have, that they care about it deeply. And so if you're collecting personal information from the public, from customers, in whatever capacity you're doing your job, or from students at the university, make sure you have the proper authorization to collect it. Consent is essential in a business context. In an academic context, you may be required to provide some information as students are to the university, but not broadly. So I always urge them to keep that in mind. And what I suggest to businesses is, do you have a data map? A data map is a great idea, and most companies don't have it. Because often when they collect personal information from their customers, at the first instance where they're collecting information, they often do obtain consent. But then once the company has it, the information can flow throughout the company to different departments and different uses that may not have been authorized. And so if you have a data map of how your information flows throughout your company or throughout the university, or you can see if the necessary consents have been obtained. That's just one thought.
Oh, that's a great technique. And so regardless of where your role was, you could be identifying these independent but very important instances of where that's happening, where the data is moving, and contribute to your institution's data map.
Exactly.
That's very cool.
Captured. Okay.
Oh, and thank you so much for joining us this morning. This has just been delightful. I personally will want to hear more about your trust by design and to share that with our community. And we will make sure that your Twitter feed and your email and all of that is available to everybody so that folks can reach out to you.
Wonderful. And I look forward to meeting with you live when I come to Arizona in November.
Definitely. We will find ways to keep the conversation going. Thank you so much.
Okay, we can have lunch.
Ooh,
Thank you. Bye-bye.
thanks, Anne.